Hello and welcome to the top 10 most likely unseen issues in a managerial case study. This is the final video in our series, and essentially what I'm going to do is just take you through a summary of the case and of the issues that we've brought out over the past few videos, and basically just give you my ideas of what are the likely issues to arise. Now, don't hold this against me, and obviously this is not a sure thing, but based on what we've seen in the case and based on what we've seen in previous exams, hopefully this will be a pretty good fit. So let's start by going through the basis of my choice. So of course you can first of all see here the focus in the pre-scene, and this relates to the space devoted and the degree of importance. Now, what I mean by that is the amount of space in the pre-scene dedicated to these issues. For example, if there's a point that only takes up a sentence, it's perhaps less likely that that is going to arise. Yet, if you've got a certain issue that has pages and pages dedicated to it, then of course there's a much better chance that that will come up. After all, why would the examiner spend all that time putting all that information in, having you review all that information for no purpose? And of course the degree of importance. Now, all topics are important in the CIMA exam, and obviously you should have learned all of it as you've been going through your studies, but there are certain topics that CIMA considers very important, such as ethics. Now, ethics is a very key overarching issue that you will have seen throughout your CIMA studies. And then strategic importance. So that's SWOT exam that we built up in the last video, and we built up over the course of the video series. Things that are going to relate to that issue. What were the strengths of the organization, and how are we going to test those strengths? What things could improve on those strengths? Which things could challenge those strengths? And again, my past experience, so exams that I've written or exams that I've seen and things like that. And also here, how easy it is to write issues on that subject. Now, examiners are people like you and me. When they're tasked with creating the exam, they're obviously going to look at what is really easy to test. Now, what topics can I write a question on simply? And also, this is good for you in that it's an area that's not too obscure, not too difficult. Not in a sense that it's not challenging, but if it was a really, really obscure, really niche area of questioning, that could cause issues with people sitting the exam. So how do you prepare for these issues going forward? Now, obviously we've been working through the pre-scene together over the past few videos, and we've been picking out on some key points that you should have been working on. So things like the PESTLE analysis and the SWOT analysis and the Porter's 5 forces charts that we've been building up as we've been going along. You should be researching these and revising these, making sure they're up together. But also, an important point I've put in here is to bear in mind that the unseen may reveal additional information, and it's important that you take on board this additional information. You will get no marks if you ignore the extra information given to you in the unseen and think, oh well, the pre-scene said something different to that, so I'm just going to go along with the pre-scene. That's not the attitude to take. That's not the course of action to take. You should be combining the knowledge of the pre-scene with the new information, the last piece of the puzzle, that is the information given in the unseen. Next of all, practice exams. Now, those of you who've done many exams before, and those of you who have been to university and remember your school exams and things like that, there's no better preparation for an exam than to practice. So it's the old mantra of practice makes perfect. So look back at previous exams. Obviously, there's only been one other MCS exam in the past. However, it couldn't hurt you to look at old E2, old F2, P2 papers as well, because those were in a much of a case study style too. Next of all, I would advise that you look at what real companies in the shipping industry are doing about certain issues. Now, I know that going forward, CIMA is not expecting you or marking you based on your analysis in comparison to the real world, but that does not mean you cannot gain some insight by doing this. For example, the company that we've often referred to throughout the video series is Maersk and MSC. Now, perhaps look online and see what they're doing about reducing their carbon emissions, about preventing the impact of piracy and things like that. That should, A, build some context in which you can operate in, but also will give you an idea of how to answer such a question were it to arise in the actual exam. And obviously, advantages and disadvantages are always a key thing to learn. You'll always get marks for bringing in the bad and the good of certain ideas, of certain plans going forward. And finally, bringing in the models that we've built up over this video series, particularly the ones that we went through in the strategic analysis in the last video. If you haven't watched that yet, I suggest you stop this video now, go back and watch that, and then join us again. So moving on to my first issue here, governance and internal audit. Now the reason why I've put this in here is because there were 2 entire pages dedicated to talking about the board and talking about governance. Now, admittedly, as far as case studies go and the companies in question in case studies, this was a very strong board. It had very good governance. It had the right amount of non-executive directors to executive directors, and also had a fully functioning audit and nomination committee. However, remember, it did not have a remuneration committee, and that is very important. That is a key weakness in their governance. Also, there were several key parts of governance that weren't mentioned, and some of these I've put up here. For example, a risk committee. There was no talk of shareholder meetings and the voting rights of the shareholders. No information on the types of shares, whether they were preference shares or ordinary shares. So that could be something that they will question. They may ask you something along the lines of how could they improve on their corporate governance. And so we go to the key points that I've put here. The ethics of good governance. Now, ethics is a key CIMA overarching issue, so you'll always be doing well in the eyes of CIMA if you bring in the ethics of something, in this case the ethics of good governance. Also, the benefits of the areas of the corporate code that were not mentioned in the exam, in the Preseen. For example, you may get extra information about that in the unseen, but we do not know yet. Now, in terms of models that you can use, it wouldn't hurt you to learn a bit about the combined code of corporate governance. Now, it's only compulsory for UK companies, and obviously as a Zealand registered company, it will not be compulsory for them. However, they are very good principles and would benefit the company, would benefit the company's stakeholders were they to implement them. And I'll just put a bit here about the the SWOT that we designed, and how it appeared in both as a strength. To a greater extent, it would probably be registered as a strength because it was a good, strong board. However, there are still some weaknesses in terms of having no remuneration committee, and also the unknowns coming back up to the top here of risk committees and shareholder meetings and things like that, of which there was no mention. Now, my next issue here is political issues. Now, as we saw in the very first page of the Preseen, the Zealand economy is very dependent on shipping, and therefore it is likely that the government will have a key interest in the shipping business. And also, as a company that operates on an international scale, it is bound by the laws of many other countries. And if, for example, a certain government in a certain country were to decide something that was against shipping, or again that worked against how Flote operates, then that could cause problems. So government relations are very important to the long-term success of an international shipping company. And so which models could we use here? Well, of course, there is the pestle analysis. And as you should have been aware of, this fulfills both the political and legal aspects of that. And again, I've put a bit here about ethical rights and wrongs. Again, referring to this ethical code which CIMA loves. And finally, the Mendelow's matrix, the stakeholder mapping. As a very powerful entity in terms of the effects that it can have upon our business, we would most likely put it in the keep satisfied category, because of course they're not going to be paying attention to every little thing we do, but we still have to keep them in mind because their role as members of parliament, as government, can have a detrimental effect on our business should they decide to do something that goes against how we operate. So on to issue 8, product analysis. Now, in comparison to previous cases, we don't really have the product range here. We only really have 2, maybe 3 main products, main business units, and that of course is Flote Shipping, Flote Logistics and Flote IT, which is a part of Flote Logistics. So given the limited number of products, it's perhaps unlikely that you'll get too much on product analysis, but the reason why I've put this in here, particularly under the product life cycle, is because of those newspaper articles that we saw in the Preseen, talking about how the shipping industry had reached its maturity, that it was no longer really going to be growing. And so to me that indicates there may be some sort of product life cycle style question in the paper. I've also put here about profitability analysis. So those of you who've recently done P2 will know about this from your kind of revenue analysis and things like that. So the reason why I've put that in as well is because of those costs that we saw associated with Flote Logistics, how it could have maintained its fairly strong revenues but then had such a dramatic drop in profit. Obviously we don't know exactly what might have been the cause of that. We may be given some extra information which reveals that. So we have to look at the profitability of these certain products that Flote provides. Because, for example, if it turns out that Flote Logistics is going to keep dropping in profits and eventually going to be working at a loss, we would then have to discuss the viability of divesting that industry. But of course there may be other factors in play there, such as would that affect the Flote shipping industry if we no longer had our logistics company to help load and unload those ships. And as you can see here, as we've just discussed, there were lots of key facts and figures regarding the finances and operations of each of these two industries, of these two companies. And also the limitations of float shipping in particular, suggested throughout. This again comes back to my emphasis on the fact that they do not offer oil tankers, bulk carriers or vehicle carriers. And another reason for this is that it's a topic that covers both E, F and P topics. So this will be a great area in the eyes of an examiner, of a script writer, because they know they can test your knowledge across all three papers with such a question. So let's take a look at what points I've said to raise here. The shipping is mature, so that comes from the newspaper article that we saw. So that you should be thinking about what kinds of strategies should we be applying to a company that is in its mature stage. But where are Flote Logistics and Flote IT? We don't have any necessary information about them to decide whether they are in the introductory stage or the growth stage, or they too could be in the maturity stage or even the decline stage. We just don't know at this point in time. So that is an important thing to consider as well. And as I've said here, the product life cycle is the key model here. I've also put the sustainability, acceptability, feasibility chart here just because that is something that you could also use, as in particularly with growing the product or with assessing the continuation of the product or the viability of the product.